This episode of the podcast is brought to you by New Bloom Labs.
New Bloom Labs continues to position itself at the cutting edge of cannabis science. They have the most comprehensive potency analysis there is, with potency testing of Delta 8, Delta 9, 2 isomers of Delta 10, and a dozen other major and minor cannabinoids that are shaping the industry. New Bloom Labs also has the fastest turnaround time in the industry. That's right, they always provide next business day turnaround on potency tests and 1 to 2 business day turnaround on terpene profiles and screenings for heavy metals, pesticides, residual solvents, and mycotoxins. You no longer need to be frustrated with your third-party lab. Turn to New Bloom Labs. Give them a call today at 844-TEST-CBD or visit their website at newbloomlabs.com. Superior science, rapid results, New Bloom Labs. Hello, my fellow people of the plant. Kevin Carrillo here, and welcome to another episode of the Cannabinoid Connect podcast. My guest today is Dr. Pritesh Kumar, Managing Director at Phytosciences Consultants. Dr. Pritesh Kumar, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Kevin. Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's going to be a very interesting conversation today on the podcast because not only do you have a strong background in the science of the cannabinoids, but you also have a global perspective. And so I'm interested to kind of learn about the different countries and how advanced and far along they are in research and development when it comes to the cannabis plant.
Perfect.
Awesome. So are you, correct if I'm wrong, but are you residing in Switzerland at the moment? Is that right?
Yes, I split my time between Europe and Canada. So primarily I'm based in Europe, but over the last year, I have been spending significant time, pre-COVID, significant time at my recent position as the director of cannabis research at Cannabinoid College in Ontario, Canada.
Got you. Okay. So, and the reason I ask is because I know that you're a consultant, or you're the managing director, excuse me, at Phytosciences Consultants, and they're a Switzerland-based consultancy firm that basically serves across the EU, Africa, Canada, India, the US. So, let's kind of set the stage and talk about maybe your area of focus, or if some knowledge that you have of countries that are operating right now in the cannabis space, and again, how far along they are in terms of research and science and even adoption and adult use.
Absolutely. So, let me take a step back. My background is traditionally as a pharmacologist. So I did my PhD in pharmacology, and my entire dissertation at the time was around cannabis pharmacology, specifically looking at the pharmacology of the CB2 cannabinoid receptor and seeing what the mechanism of action would be of some of these compounds that interact with the receptor. Now, this was at a time when certainly not the media. Go ahead, Kevin.
And the CB2 receptor, just to be clear, that is what kind of controls your intestine, kind of your gut, right? Not the brain receptor. Is that correct? Or
that is correct. The CB2 receptor, while it has some minimal presence in the central nervous system, like in your brain and spinal cord, most of the CB2 receptor expression is in the peripheral system. So your immune cells, your T cells, your B cells. So you're right.
Got you. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so that's primarily my background. And at that time, certainly not too many people in the media were talking about cannabis, let alone CBD. So it was a very different time. And, you fast forward a number of years and it's an everyday conversation down the street, in a coffee shop, wherever you are. So very different times. After I left academics, I started in the private sector consulting, and my initial foray was in cannabis. So this was 2012, 2013, when Canada had just put together the legal framework, and I was using a lot of my science background to help early companies develop in-house labs, assist them with putting together the scientific team, the manufacturing team to produce the end products. So that's really where I got my start in the private cannabis sector. Sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
No, it's fine. I want to kind of just take this piece by piece. So that's interesting that you were a consultant in the lab testing space in Canada during the 2012 time, because that's when, of course, the entire country went legal, right? or was it later than that?
No, it was right around that time. So it went legal around 2013, 2014. But right before that happened, of course, there was legislation that was moving through the government and private companies, a lot of these companies started to put together their business plans around cannabis and what kind of teams they needed to form to get these licenses and build out their infrastructure. So that's
Right.
really a lot of the work I did at that time, whether it was a testing lab or a manufacturing, and things like that. So that's really where I spent the bulk of my
Right.
consulting.
So the 2012, with the wheels were in motion, right? Getting prepared for that blanket adult use, right? Reform. So my question first is, let's start there with the lab testing. I talk a lot, and I've had experts on from the lab testing space, and we obviously know that in this country there is a lab testing problem, right? Um, there's lab shopping going on. There's equipment that's not up to standard, cleanliness protocols that aren't being followed. So my question is, we talk about comparing the different states, and I know Michigan is kind of one example that's doing better than most other states in terms of working with their policymakers to implement regulations and compliance frameworks that actually work and set those high standards. So how does Canada compare to the US in terms of their standards and best practices when it comes to lab testing?
It's a great question. So there's a few things going on, right? So because cannabis is federally legal, both medically and recreationally, before recreational was medical, when that happened, Health Canada put together a committee to draft and develop the standards that every lab will follow, right? So it's a federal mandate. The comparison is when that happens in the US, the FDA or an appropriate body would pass down regulations and standards and protocols to the labs that are testing this product. That has not happened here. What has happened here is states have legalized. What has happened in the US, states have legalized, and some states have recommendations on the type of test they're to conduct, but rarely would you see a protocol given down from a state that a lab has to follow. So labs are left to develop their in-house methods. Now that's great, and that's viable. But what the challenge is when you have a state and there's multiple labs, and each lab has a different set of protocols. They may all have the same equipment, but if they're doing sample prep differently, if they have different parameters on an HPLC, you may get differing results. So that contributes to a lot of this lab shopping. The other kind of incentive for lab shopping is more along the lines of it's born in the US cannabis industry that higher THC generates higher profits, right? So you see a lot of, or higher CBD, for example. So you see a lot of lab shopping in that manner as well. But I
Yeah,
think to answer your question, it comes back to guidance from the federal government. That's what, Canada has taken the lead on. And, that's why you rarely see instances of lab testing issues across Canada. Now you'll see a recall every now and then, but a recall actually is good. It means the program is working. And when a company initiates a recall in Canada, it's saying, hey, so we did something wrong. We need to go back and retest. We don't really see that in the United States, right? If there is no such thing as that. There's no mechanism for that.
right. Yeah. So it sounds like, I mean, Canada just really kind of banded together when they saw that they were going to go full adult use, and got their government got involved right away and started, probably working with the industry to make sure that these protocols and these regulatory compliance things were in place. Right. And here we're kind of just fending for ourselves at the state level. With the lack of FDA consumer oversight, especially when it comes to CBD products. Uh, have you heard anything in terms of like when we may get that oversight, or is it still just up in the air?
I think it's still up in the air. It's still up in the air. Now there is some indication at the start of, kind of towards the tail end of last year, going into this year. Before I would say the end of last year and the start of this year, when a CBD manufacturer would make claims on their product without having it substantiated by some type of clinical evidence, the FDA, if they caught you, they would essentially just send you a warning letter, right? They would send CBD manufacturers a warning letter saying, hey, your website says this, your social media says this, you need to take it down, or we'll pursue further action. Now what we're seeing is is a significant change. At the start of this year and towards the tail end of last year, the FDA started actually issuing fines of significant amounts, 25,000, 50,000 US to CBD companies that are egregiously making these claims. So the crackdown is coming, and there are fines associated now with it. But it's still up in the air when it'll become final.
Right. Well, at least there's penalty and at least kind of action that's being taken to hold some of these bad actors accountable. That's at least positive and encouraging to hear. But full oversight is definitely needed, and we're still kind of waiting on pins and needles for that to come. Okay, so Dr. Pritesh, let's get back to your journey. So we talked about the lab space, you're consulting in Canada. So kind of walk us through your journey next within the industry.
Sure. So, after a few years in Canada, other markets started to open up. One in particular was in Latin America and in Colombia. So there was a Canadian group that had started a venture. I was already consulting for that Canadian group in Canada, and they had started they were the first company to start in Colombia. They're called Farmacielo. They were a small private company at the time, great founders, great vision. They said, "Hey, would you be willing to come down to Colombia and help build this?" And I said, absolutely. I need to talk to my wife, but absolutely. And the minute I landed in Colombia, Kevin, I'll tell you the image I had in my head of drugs and violence and narco terrorism immediately went out the window the minute I stepped off the plane in Medellin. A completely different type of image, and a very, very beautiful country, very different than what most people would think when they think Colombia, right? And
Right.
of course, this was also at a time. This was 2015, 2016 now, and Colombia had just started putting together the medical framework for cannabis, and this is at a time when the narco terrorism had stopped or stopped to some extent. There's a shift in government, shift in policy. So it was very exciting. So I spent quite a bit of time down there, learned some Spanish along the way, made some good friends, made some great contacts, and it was exciting.
Yeah, I can't. I mean, I see that show Narcos, and I, of course, look online at Medellin pictures. It just looks amazing, beautiful out there.
Beautiful. The people were very welcoming. It's a great environment, great temperature. Just a great overall country in Latin America.
Yeah, and what's the kind of feeling in terms of like cannabis on both the medicinal perspective and adult use perspective? Like, is it just part of everyday life? Is it new in terms of how advanced they're getting, or what is the mood?
All right. So let me explain it this way. So when I first arrived in Colombia, the mood was very different, right? It was, cannabis was still very taboo, and it still is to a certain extent. In a country that's dealt with a lot of issues with drugs, cocaine, violence, any type of substance is carries a level of concern, and still in many circles, that is still how it is. Cannabis is still taboo, even though it's medically legal. There's a program going on. There's several dozens of companies now in Colombia that are setting up operations, but at that time it was still it was still very taboo to even speak about it publicly.
Yeah, yeah, I know that Chiron has some footing in Colombia, and also Clever Leaves, I believe.
That's
Also,
correct. Both
yeah.
great companies.
Great companies, yes. Really set up for success in the Latin American markets.
Yeah, I think Colombia is one of the stronger nations, economically in Latin America. And when Colombia legalized medical cannabis, it created kind of a trigger effect in a few other Latin American nations. You had Chile, you had Argentina, you had a few other nations looking at medical cannabis because Colombia was able to emerge and come out as a leader in Latin America.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking on this topic, this is a good segue. So let's talk about some of these emerging markets that we're seeing, particularly in West Africa. Specifically Nigeria, Ghana. Like, what is going on there, and like, how are they viewing the plant in terms of medicinal and adult use?
Yeah, great question. So emerging markets are interesting and exciting, and the whole continent of Africa is going through a revolution when it comes to cannabis. 2017 was a big year for Africa. Lesotho, tiny nation, legalized cannabis, sort of out of the blue. Came out of nowhere. Nobody was prepared for it. And it has a small active program. Then you had other countries in East Africa. Right now we have Uganda, for example. Uganda has an active program since the last 2 years. Just a few months ago, the first export out of Uganda and import into Israel was successful. So you see the export potential coming out of African nations. Recently, Malawi just legalized. South Africa has a program. But up until recently, West Africa is largely untouched. So West African nations comprising, for example, like Ghana, Nigeria, Cameroon, Sierra Leone, Senegal, the Gambia, out of the West African nations, the two that are pushing policy actively are, of course, one, Nigeria, and two, Ghana, right? So Nigeria, Africa's biggest economy, 200 plus million people. It's a massive, massive machine. And they have now pushed 3 or 4 bills through the legislation. It's not legal yet, but there is active discussion and active movement towards legalizing some type of medical cannabis in Nigeria, which is amazing. You talk about Nigeria where, it's 200 plus million people, massive economy, and you have a huge disparity in wealth. The average person can't afford medication. It's struggle for food. You have a lot of issues in Nigeria in addition to the violence. And then when you introduce cannabis, you think, wow, this could really disrupt the economy in a beneficial way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one. Right next door, obviously, we're close by. You have Ghana, right? Ghana just had a re-election. The president was re-elected. The previous president was re-elected, and the country's going through another transformation with industrial hemp. So the cannabis conversation has started, but it's more of a CBD conversation in Ghana. So in 2020 of last year, the Parliament of Ghana passed the industrial hemp CBD legislation. Basically, it's similar to a lot of other nations where the THC has to be below 0.3. Now, Ghana has yet to put the mechanism in place for quality control, export, and that type of infrastructure. But, it's exciting to see, what is going on in Africa and especially West Africa. It's very exciting.
Yeah. I mean, is this a global movement? I mean, it seems like it because we obviously saw the single convention scheduling of cannabis at the United Nations level being descheduled, right? I think they moved it to like Schedule 2 or Schedule 3. So, I mean, it just seems like more and more different countries are just kind of seeing the value add of the plant, right? And all the benefits that come with it in terms of, medicinal, economic, environmental. I just read it, I think an article that France is talking about legalizing adult use nationwide. So what is it exactly? Like, what are you seeing in terms of this global trend?
Yeah, I think you've hit it on the nail. This is absolutely a global trend, and the rate and pace of legalization is enormous. Just recently, I'll bring it back to Africa quickly, but Rwanda, right? Rwanda legalized cannabis for export only by essentially presidential order. Came out of nowhere. It just happened. There was no prior discussion, at least externally, probably some internally. And you see these things and you think, wow, it takes sometimes months and years to put together legislation, but you see some countries just doing it rapidly. I think it's a combination of the economic times and the potential of what this type of product can do to everyone in terms of the supply chain from farmers all the way up, right? It hits almost every point along the way and drives value at every point.
Yeah.
I think that's really what's going on with the rate of legalization.
Yeah. And to that point, that it just drives value in basically every aspect all the way through the supply chain. Let's not forget you said industrial hemp for CBD, but I'm talking industrial hemp for material goods, right? So I mean, that is in its baby infancy, right? We haven't even scratched the surface there due to the lack of infrastructure, processing centers for decorticating, right? Separating the fiber from herd. But I think once we get there, it's going to be so fascinating to see how each country kind of plays in the space? Because obviously every country is going to see the medicinal value, but which countries are really going to kind of hone in and hyper focus on that industrial hemp for material goods side?
I agree. And, I think the early leader again is Canada. Just recently, a US based investment firm called Merida Capital assisted with the financing of an Alberta, Canada based industrial hemp setup. We're talking well over $15-20 million. And this time going in reverse, right? A US company, US investment firm deploying capital in Alberta, Canada to build out that industrial aspect of hemp. So I think it's fascinating. I think, at least right now, the activity in North America is starting to go in reverse. When it first started, Canada was fantastic. It is still fantastic. It has a lot of issues with supply chain and distribution, but in terms of financing, banking, capital markets, Canada is viewed as the leader in stability for cannabis globally, right? And for the first time, or one of the few recent times, you see American investment firms deploying capital into Canada. It's very exciting.
Yeah, no, definitely. So, I mean, it's interesting how to see kind of the tide rising, right? With so much public support, we hear Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer talking about cannabis reform at the federal level. So I say the rising tide because you're seeing these cannabis stocks, these publicly traded companies in Canada, along with the MSOs in the United States, really starting to take off. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot more momentum for Canada, because the US is really getting serious about this issue also.
I agree. I think the U.S. is getting serious, and of course, the message from that senator was big, right? That type of message has not been received in the United States for a number of years. So, I think there's some big change ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk now about the science aspect to all this, right? So, Dr. Pritesh, talk to me about the importance of genomics when it comes to cannabis. And, I guess from a legal perspective, an IP perspective, and a medicinal perspective.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's great. Let's start with the definition. So, what is genomics, right? So, genomics is the study of genes and function and structure. So, similar to humans, we're composed of amino acids and DNA and protein, right? That makes up our genetic structure. Along our genetic code, we have areas that can be investigated or sequenced to assess risk on if we're going to develop, or are we predisposed to a certain condition like diabetes or cardiovascular risk. Now, in similarity and in contrast, let's take it to agriculture. Genomics is a field that's emerged in the last 5 to 10 years. The science has come a long way. The utility has come a long way. And I think it's one of the cases where, cannabis these technologies are just waiting for cannabis, right? Genomics is very powerful. And I'll give you a relevant example. Let's take hemp breeders, for example. So hemp breeders generally want to avoid a significant level of THC in the plants, right? Now, the
Point
only way
three.
up is 0.3, that's right. And in Europe, a lot of EU nations, it's 0.2. So, in the US, it's 0.3. And, hemp breeders want to avoid the production of this compound, and they want the production of CBD, right? For the regulatory and export markets. As such, they have a vested interest in looking at the genetic basis of their plants or of their seeds, right? The technology has come so far that there is an ability to detect or analyze the sequence in the material before it gets to the flowering stage. So let's take it back. Typically, the THC quantification cannot be done or analyzed until the plants are flowering, and that could be several weeks or a month or two outward, right?
Mhm.
Now, with genomics, you have the ability to actually say, okay, you know what? This particular variety or seedling is THC dominant, or it's CBD dominant, or the THC production gene could be silenced, or it could be shut off, or it's upregulated, downregulated. We have that ability with genomics. It's powerful. The example that applies across agriculture is the integration of genomics and looking at corn, soy, rice, determining if a particular variety is going to be resistant to mold, to different pathogens. So that's really what the power of genomics represents and can do.
And how long does it typically take to get a certain variety or genetic stable?
That can take, so stabilization of genetics can take a few generations. So it can take a few cycles in a true breeding program.
So that would be something that I guess a cultivator would want to consider, right? Before like buying a certain genetic, ensuring that those genetics are stable so that they're getting exactly what they're paying for.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. And so let's also talk. I know your background is in pharmacy and toxicology, but specifically focused on cannabinoids. So, you being a consultant and operating in different countries, I'm sure that you've been able to do a little bit more testing and even human testing trials as opposed to what we're able to do here in the US because of the medicinal laws and whatnot. So, what are you learning from a cannabinoid perspective as it relates to pharmaceuticals?
Yeah. So, it's a great question. And I'll start with, what I would consider, what many would consider um, the early the early evidence for cannabinoids clinically, right? And that was mainly conducted by GW Pharmaceuticals, right? So for epilepsy, the first, not well, Marinol was always in the United States, but the first FDA approved drug around cannabis was is typically considered as Epidiolex, right?
And
And that was for CBD.
Epidiolex was the government patent synthetic cannabinoid, correct?
That is correct. That
Okay.
is correct. No, Marinol is the government synthesized. Epidiolex came from GW Pharmaceuticals in London. So they've been around since the late 90s and they wanted to develop the product for the indication of epilepsy. And then they went down the FDA route. The synthetic THC is Marinol,
Got
which
you.
has been around in the US for at least 2 decades. And that's that's indicated for chemo patients with nausea and vomiting. Then we take a look at Canada, right? Health Canada approved one drug, cannabis-based drug called Sativex, which is a one-to-one CBD to THC for MS patients with neuropathic pain. So those are kind of the two bulk, and then there have been some sub-studies under those same drugs for different things. What I've seen the most in is the investigation of cannabinoids for some type of pain, some type of pain, some type of anxiety, and then we see some in the neuro field. So for Parkinson's, for ALS, with not much development there. So that's where I see the most of it, and where I see it going now. Well, let me take a step back. The last 4 to 5 years in Canada, right? We've seen a tremendous growth in cannabis production, legalization, you know, financial activities, capital coming in. But if we look at what has happened in terms of research and clinical trials in Canada in the last 4 to 5 years in cannabis, we have not seen a tremendous amount. Now, I think that is going to start changing. I think when Canada went recreational, there was a massive change in the dynamic, right? It went from medical for a short period of time to now recreational, and one got left behind. So I think now that the market is coming back to medical, at least in Canada, we should start seeing an increase in investigation of clinical efficacy of cannabinoids.
Hmm.
One of the things I see quite often is, and just recently, I think even in the US news outlets, there was quite a bit of coverage around the relationship between opiates and cannabis, right? So
Yeah,
we
that's what I wanted to get to. So yeah, let's dive into that. So like I guess two-part question. First is like, how is cannabis helping or as you're seeing anecdotal evidence or what have you to see how it's addressing mental health? And then, the opioid conversation, right? I mean, I've read articles saying that the increase of consumption of cannabis during the pandemic has actually lessened the hospital visits and opioid addiction and whatnot. So there is some kind of, cause and effect here.
Yeah, it's interesting. Causality studies are difficult because the conclusions are difficult to analyze, right? And that's with every causality study, right? But we're seeing significant significant investigation into, is cannabis a potential potential tool to A, for pain relief, whether that's acute pain or chronic pain, and B, as a viable substitute for opioids in chronic pain. These are very tough studies to conduct, right? So up until now, and well, let me take a step back. The reason why they're tough to conduct is, let's say you have a patient on opiates, right? Opiates are highly addictive, and withdrawal of an opiate or a cessation or stopping opiate use instantly could result in death, right? It's that
Right.
severe. So to conduct a clinical trial around substituting an opiate with another drug like cannabis is very difficult. But what we can look at is the data, right? And we can do observational studies, which have been done, in North America and in Europe. And what we do see is a clear reduction in opiate use as a result of some type of cannabis legalization in that market. Now, again, that's causality, right? So we can't derive any significant conclusions from it, but there, in terms of anecdotal evidence, you know, there's quite a bit of anecdotal evidence with medical patients saying, cannabis is helping my pain and it's helping to reduce the opiate dose and potentially even get me off of opiates, right? And what we want to look at is, in addition to those things, is quality of life. Is cannabis or something else really helping your quality of life compared to opiates? That should be one of the key metrics in any study looking at cannabis versus opiates or opiates versus cannabis.
What are you seeing in terms of the current state of like opioid research and like the future direction in which that particular, part of the industry is going to go? I mean, we've been hearing about the opioid crisis for how many years now, right? So like, are they working to kind of fix this kind of issue, or what are they doing on that side?
It's a good question. What we do see a lot of are traditional and long-standing opiate R&D and manufacturing companies, and really pharma companies, trying to develop a what they consider a non-addictive opiate, right? Or they're looking at introducing and developing cannabinoid programs within their pharmaceutical companies, right? So we've seen a few examples of typical or the larger opiate manufacturers, you know, introducing or researching cannabis as a potential for their chronic pain patient base, right? Now that's the reason for that is for a lot, and you hit it right. It's it has been a epidemic for a long time, right? It's an epidemic in Europe. It's in certain countries. It's in North America. The U.S. is the biggest abuser of opiates. Canada second, and then we go from there. But generally speaking, there to address this problem is multifold, right? It's not just let's develop a new drug and get a patient off opiates, right? It's let's look at the behavior, let's look at the mental health, let's take a look at how to reintroduce them to how they're going to live their life, right? So it's multifactorial, and fundamentally, physicians need an alternative to opiates for chronic pain. That just remains a fact among everybody, right? They're up until now, cannabis is seen as potentially a viable alternative to opiates for pain relief, but up until now, it's been opiates for the last 4 or 5 decades. So coming out of that is not going to be as easy as somebody saying, well, let's just legalize cannabis everywhere, right, and get all these people off opiates. It's really not that simple. This has been going on for decades. So it's going to take, institutions, it's going to take mental health facilities, it's going to take coordination of, pain physicians, psychiatrists. It will be a big effort.
Yeah, no doubt. Like at the logistic level, and really peeling back the onion, because these institutions have been operating the same way for so long. I mean, I 100% agree. One thing I do think though that may kind of kick them in the butt a little bit is that the real life testimonials that we're hearing every day.
I agree.
There's so many people that, I mean, and you can't deny, you call it quote unquote anecdotal evidence, but these are real life testimonials of people that are seeing more benefits and less issues long term, making that transition from opioids to cannabis. And um, while we're talking on the topic of mental health, I do want to touch on like as in your science and in your research, have y'all come across or dove deeper into psychedelics like psilocybin or ibogaine efficacy as it relates to mental illness, PTSD, all those types of things?
It's an interesting question. And it's a good question. You know, the field of mental health, when we talk about mental health and mental and psychiatric conditions, we think of bipolar, schizophrenia, ADHD, anxiety. That field has not seen a new drug development that actually works, I would say probably in decades, right? That could be for a number of reasons, whether it's lack of funding going into mental health. I mean, it could be for a variety of reasons, but some of these, plant-based compounds, psilocybin, the only time I came across Ibogaine was actually in West Africa. And, I've seen a number of people use it there and physicians use it in the clinics there. And it was the first time I came across it. And I thought it was fascinating. You have people in villages that use Ibogaine, and in North America and in Europe, people know nothing about it, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And for those listening, I don't want to butcher this, but I believe ibogaine, it comes from the iboga plant or the root, and it originated from the Bawiti tribe in Africa. And yeah, like you said, I mean, like I've had two guests on, one Stephen Gottlieb, and he's a plant practitioner, and also Ty Burgess, and they talked about how they had an opioid addiction. I mean, Ty had a severe chronic pain and issues there, and then Stephen also had an opioid addiction, and when they took ibogaine and went through that whole kind of process, it worked. It was pretty incredible to hear their true life testimonials. um so
I
yeah.
would agree. The first time I saw it was when I spent time in Cameroon and then again in Sierra Leone. I saw clinics and I'm still in contact with a lot of these physicians. And when they have, people in the village or people in the cities coming down from narcotics or opiates, they transition them with Ibogaine. And I thought, wow, we know nothing about this in Europe or North America, and this has been used here for many, many, many years.
Right. Yeah. It's fascinating. We're kind of entering this world now where we're marrying Eastern medicine and Western medicine, right? We're kind of going back to some of our roots while implementing some of the innovative pharmaceutical practices that we've, developed over the years. And it's been a great conversation today, Dr. Pritesh. We've covered emerging markets from a global perspective, the science behind cannabinoids when it comes to pharmaceutical medicine, and of course, the discussion of plant-based alternative medicine as it relates to mental health. So it's been really, really insightful, and I know that our audience got a lot out of it. Before we wrap up, is there anything that you want to leave the audience with?
I think if I were to leave the audience with something, I would say, the greatest skill we can have in today's world is the ability to unlearn what we've learned in the past and be able to learn new things, right? And that applies to physicians who never knew about the endocannabinoid system, or to physicians who were strictly opposed to cannabis. I think if I could leave a message, it's, give yourself the ability to unlearn what you've learned your entire life and be open to something new.
That's well said. Well said, sir. So, hey, where can people find y'all's website, social media, if they wanted to follow and learn more?
Yeah, so www.phytosciences.com. I'm also the director of cannabinoid research at Canada College. And yeah, thank you for your time and thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Kathleen Gonzalez, as well, for making this introduction. Thank you, Kevin. It was fun.
Yes, shout out to Kathleen and Elevated PR. She's awesome. And yes, Dr. Pritesh, want to have you on again real soon, man. Let's run it back.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
All right, and thanks for listening, guys. Bye.